Yeah, so like I said, we'll talk about the navigation Jetpack component. Now, before I really get into the specifics of navigation, what you can do with it, I think it's important to talk about activities versus fragments and where is their place in all of this and why navigation exists and what does it help us with. So I put together this side-by-side here of activities and fragments. Comparing the two. So activities, they're a system level component. So the same level as a broadcast receiver, services, you start them, pass data between them with intents, and you have to declare them in your Android manifest. Activities, they're a UI controller. You give them data and change the label on your view, show or hide, and navigate from place to place. And they belong to a task. So your recent screen, you have your tasks that you swipe between. The tasks managing a backstack of the activities in the same task. Well, on the other hand, with fragments, they are a piece of the user interface. So they can act as a UI controller, same way an activity would. Send the data in, change your views, what you're showing there. But they belong to an activity. You don't declare them in the Android manifest. And instead of belonging to a task directly, you have your fragment manager, which is controlling the backstack there, which makes fragments a little bit more reusable and flexible for us. So the question comes up, okay, then if they're similar in that aspect, aside from how do I create them, when would I use the activity versus the fragment? And that kind of brings up the question, single activity app or multi-activity app? There's been a lot of talk about single activity from Google in the last I/O and Dev Summit. And I think that question is a little bit interesting since there has been a lot of push towards single activity. I think my personal opinion is I think you should get as close to single activity that makes sense for your app. It's the right tool for the right job, right? So there are cases where we do want to have multiple activities, but at the same time, I feel like activities could be overused or abused at the same time. So one thing I like to think fragment first and then activity. If it doesn't make sense to use a fragment here, maybe your UI has a bigger scope, then maybe an activity is a better case there. And there's some other cases I'll talk about later. Not to mention, most of the UI components work off of the notion of using fragments. So you have tab layouts with the view pagers, view pager 2, and view pager, which you can hook up with that. Bottom navigation view, navigation drawer, and others. They all work really great with fragments. And so Ian Lake in the Dev Summit of 2018, he showed this diagram in his presentation that using fragments can better scope your data between screens. And so here he's got your application scope, your activity scope, and then this is what I felt like he was really trying to drill into in his talk, was changing our mindset from, okay, we're talking about activities and fragments to we're talking about destinations, a flow of screens in our app. And he also compared it to how we can use view models better to share data between screens with these fragments where we can scope them to fragments, activities, and I'll show you, you can scope them to view model or nav graphs. Just makes things a little bit easier to work with in your app. So a few quotes from him in that talk where there are a few cases where even today we do recommend using multiple activities. You don't actually need multiple activities, what you need are multiple tasks. And I thought this was an interesting statement. And then there's a one-to-one between windows and tasks. And so now he's taken this concept of tasks and bringing it out to, or activities and bringing it out to tasks. So what I want to show you guys is how Google is using tasks in, get to it, how Google's using tasks in their Google Docs app.
Would you say tasks are a superset of an activity?
I think so, yeah. And so what we'll see here is, so you go to your recent screen, right? And then you see your recent apps. What you're really seeing tasks. And those tasks are managing that activity stack. And so what we're going to see here, here we go. So you can see I've got a single task. And I'm going to open up the task 1 document. I'm going to go back. This is the same app. And there's task 2. We see we have 2 activities, but 3 tasks. And the really nice thing about setting this up to work with tasks is now when you have tablets, multi-screen, split screen, you can see now we can copy and paste same activity, but we can now work multitask a lot easier. The user has more power. So I can and so that's really the power of tasks right there. And so this is a really good use case of when you do want to have multiple activities, but this activity has been pretty much built to work as a task. Any questions there?
And that's not using fragments yet, right?
So they've probably got a fragment in the activity, but that is pretty much 2 activities working to create 3 tasks. If that makes sense. All right. So what we just saw is this new document launch mode. So if you're familiar, when you're defining your activities in the manifest, you can set an affinity, you can set your launch mode. In the launch modes, you have the standard launch mode where it's just going to create your activity next on the stack of activities. There's single top, where if you have activity A and B, and your back stack of activities is activity A on the bottom, B is present, and then you start activity with activity B again. Single top would say, oh, activity B is already on the top. So rather than creating 2 activity Bs in a row in the stack, I'm just going to send this new intent to the one that's already up there and then let you update the UI from there. And then where things really get messy is with single task and single instance. Single task, when you create that activity, it's going to create that activity in a new task, but let you have other activities in that task stack. While single instance says, I'm going to create this activity in a new task, and this activity can be, it's alone. I can't have other activities in its stack. But the way Android displays this to the user, and then the way us as developers work with that, it gets really messy. I was just doing something the other day where things were set up as single instance, and I was trying to finish my activity stack, and it just didn't work right. When I opened up the app again, there was my activity. It just got really messy. And Ian in his talk also talked about this. He said, in API 1, these were really great, but now today, not so much. There's better ways to do this. And so like that animation I just showed you, they're using document launch mode, where you have these 2 properties, into existing and always. And so what we saw in the video was into existing, where it's saying the activity gets its own task, and always will say, we're always going to launch this in its new task. So like if you're creating a new, like an email client, for example, would be a good case of using always. But into existing, where you have a specific ID that goes to that activity. Does that make sense? It's kind of hard to describe. So into existing would say, like, I have a document with a specific ID. I always want that to be associated if I created that activity again with that ID, but if it's a different ID, create another task. So hopefully that made sense. And so that's a great example for when you'd want to create a new activities. If you have a pattern like that and you want to use document launch mode. Another great example of when to use an activity would be if you have something like picture in picture, so a media app like YouTube. You have to have an activity to do picture in picture, and you also, when you're working with media, you don't want to recreate the activity when you rotate the screen. You want to be able to handle that yourself. So it's good to isolate that into another activity. So not really navigation component specific, but it's good background to understand the powers of activities and fragments and where they fall into place here. So now with navigation component specifically, since they're pushing for this single activity pattern, they've built the navigation component off of this destinations concept, this concept that most of your navigation flow is within a single activity, and you've got this nav graph that's patterning how your user goes from destination to destination within that activity. So some of the benefits of navigation component are like I described, they simplify managing your destination flow within an activity. So you don't need to work with the fragment manager directly anymore. You don't need to create custom solutions for how I navigate my back stack and pop things off of the back stack and go back button to this destination instead of this one. They handle those transactions for you. They try to handle the up and back actions for you by default. They make animations between fragments easier. It'll handle deep linking and creating that back stack for you. Like we talked about earlier, it integrates really easily into UI patterns, such as using a navigation drawer or a bottom sheet. And then one really awesome feature of the navigation component is the SafeArgs Gradle plugin. And so when we pass data between activities or fragments, we're using bundles. And as we know with bundles, we can't necessarily guarantee that I've associated this ID with a string and that it's gonna be a string next time I come out. So I mean, if we've coded the app right, yeah, we can guarantee that, but anyone could go in there and say, put int instead of put string with the same ID. We can't have that guarantee. And so SafeArgs gives you this type safety that we say, this variable that needs to be passed between destinations is an integer. And when I'm interfacing with that in my code, that's a strict parameter type I'm working with now instead of a put string, put int, kind of like shared prefs. View model support. Recently, they've added view model support, where with view models, we can scope them to a fragment or an activity. Now you can actually scope your view model to a specific nav graph. And then the navigation editor, which makes it really easy to actually visualize your app's flow now. Where if you have a new developer coming in, they can now see, this is how I get to this place in my app. This is how I got to this destination.
Question on
yeah.
this last two.
Yeah.
So is it pretty much a one-to-one to have a view model per nav graph? Is that kind of a recommended route? And then also, can you have multiple nav graphs from an activity? Like if you have completely different flows that are
yeah, I think, so the first question with having a nav graph or having a view model to a nav graph, in my personal experience, I try to give the view models as little scope as they need. And so if I have a view model that's only working with data in this fragment, I only scope it to that fragment.
So you'd have multiple view models.
Yeah, and you'd have multiple view models. Now the problem with scoping it to an activity is now all of your fragments in that activity could gain access to that view model and modify it. And so maybe you have a fragment that doesn't really need to know about that. And so that's where kind of, and I'll show an example of this. That's where scoping it to the nav graph can be really powerful. So I'll show you an example of that. And sorry, what was the other question? It was?
I think it was a one-to-one if it was a nav graph per view model. And then within an activity, would it make sense to have multiple nav graphs or have an activity per nav graph?
Okay, yeah. And so typically you would have a nav graph per activity, but it is possible that you can have multiple graphs in that activity. So maybe you have two fragments side by side on a tablet. And we'll see this is called a nav host fragment. And the default nav host fragment is the one that's going to be intercepting your back button. But then you can have a second nav host fragment with another graph that's not going to intercept those system buttons, but you can have those two graphs running at the same time in the same activity. Does that answer your question? Okay. So the requirements to use navigation, it's MinSDK 14, shouldn't be too much of an issue for most people. Android Studio 3.3 or newer, using Android X in your project and at least one fragment. So to get navigation component into your project, just a couple dependencies you need to add. So if you're using Kotlin, it's navigation fragment KTX and navigation UI KTX. And currently, I think it's still 2.10. I think that changed to RCO2 recently. I'll have to double check. And then to get safe args in your top level build.gradle, you'll just add the navigation safe args Gradle plugin. And so safe args is optional. If you didn't want to use them, you don't have to add that in there. You can still use navigation component. And then in your app or modules build.gradle file, you just need to add your plugin, navigation, Android X navigation safe args, Kotlin if you're using Kotlin. So the navigation graph is a resource, just like you'd have your layouts or drawables. And so under navigation, and then you can have all your nav graphs in XML. And this is what the nav graph looks like. So here we have all of our destinations or fragments, and they're tied together by these actions. And so this is where it's really nice, where you can have this strict guarantee of the flow of your app. So as long as you're sticking to the API of navigation component, you can't accidentally go from results winner to user profile. The classes that navigation will generate won't let you have that option. So this nav graph, when you build your code, it'll generate, and if you're using safe args too, it'll generate the classes you need to get a destination and action function calls to make those destination calls. So let's go up to here. So every nav graph has to have a home destination. It's the one place it's going to start at. This gets interesting because some apps have a more dynamic flow of start destination. Maybe you have an onboarding process that needs to happen the first time, while all other times you're going to go to your main screen. And so we'll talk about some options around how to change that, but the nav graph itself, it has to have one single place to start.
Are these added dynamically? It discovers your fragments, or do you have to manually put IDs in?
You do have to manually go through and add these in. I'll show you guys in Android Studio how it looks to start interacting with this. So there's a drop down, and it detects all of the fragments in your project, and you can go and click in those and add it from here. So yeah, it's not going to auto-generate it, but it at least gives you the list you can choose from.
And it's an ID that gets put in?
So it's going to be the class name of the fragment, and you can change the ID. And so the ID becomes the destination ID. So kind of the flow of this sample app, this is one of the sample apps you can find on Google's GitHub, is you go from, so you have two routes, title screen to register, title screen to leaderboard. If you go to register and you hit the back button, you should go back to the title screen. But if you continue on, you go into this match. And when you're in this match, person one versus person two, and you're in the game, whoever wins, they're going to get this results winner screen. And so we can see the action goes from results winner, or if you lost, you're going to go to game over. Now, what happens if you're at the game over screen and you hit the back button? You shouldn't be brought back into the game. You should be brought back to at least the match screen. So how does it handle the back stack there? How does it know where to pop back to in your fragment stack? And so when we're setting up our actions, those lines, if you click on it on the side of Android Studio, there's a bunch of properties you can set. And One of the options is pop-up to, and you set the ID. This kind of goes back to your question. That ID of that destination, you want it to pop back up to. And there's also a checkbox. You can say inclusive. And so if inclusive's not checked, then if I said pop back up to the match destination, when I hit the back button, it's going to pop in game and then go back to match. But if I said inclusive, it's going to pop in game, match, and I'll be at register. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of functionality they give you there in the actions. And here in the bottom right, the user profile destination, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little link icon. And what that tells us is that you can deep link to this destination. And when you're looking at the properties for that destination, you set your URI for the deep link. And in curly braces, you create your variable names that you want to pull out of that deep link. So maybe that deep link has an ID. Then in curly braces, you use curly braces ID. And then when it registers that deep link, it's going to pull out whatever values in that URI at that position and assign that as a safe arg with that ID. And then the really nice thing, I think, is they give you placeholders. So if you're working on a feature that has multiple destinations, you don't necessarily want to go through and implement all of those destinations right away. You still want to visualize, how's my flow going to work between these destinations? So you can create placeholders that aren't actually associated with a real fragment yet. So you can still visualize your flow, create the actions, get those classes generated. So when you are working on those features and those destinations, you already have access to that. Only gotcha is at runtime. If you actually go through to that destination, you're going to crash because there's no fragment. And then the other really powerful feature of nav graphs is you can have nested graphs. So say you have a really complex app, it has a lot of destinations, maybe a couple flows that can be reached from multiple places. Using nested graphs are really useful because now you can modularize and encapsulate common flows. So when you're looking at that top level graph, your main graph, you're seeing the broad overall view of your app and how things flow. But then you can drill down into more specific flows for different use cases. And this comes really handy in conditional navigation. So that example I brought up earlier with an onboarding flow. Maybe you'll have an onboarding nav graph that has those destinations for your onboarding. And in your top level graph, you would set your home destination to your main destination and have that subgraph go into your home destination. And then at runtime, you can determine, should I be showing the onboarding flow or should I stay here at this home destination? And let's show you guys. I'm going to sit down on this part actually. Easier to show you. So I'm going to open up Android Studio here. And I'll show you guys what that interface looks like. Now I'm seeing a bunch of screenshots. All right, so here's that same nav graph that we were looking at the screenshots. And so here, if we click on this home destination, there's those properties I was talking about. So there's the ID. So there's the ID. I can set, it doesn't have to be the same name as the fragment. It's just how I want to identify that destination and the resources. And then the fragment class itself will be defined here. And then label. And so what label does is when you've hooked up your nav graph to your toolbar, your action bar, it will automatically change your toolbar's title to whatever you have in the label there. So safe args, you can set all of your arguments for that destination through here. And so name is whatever you want that variable to be in your code. And then type, you can set it to integer, float, boolean, long, string, resource reference, parsable, serializable, or an enum. If you're using the primitive types, you have access to this array checkbox. I mean, you have an array of longs. and then if this is going to be nullable or not, and then a default value. And so when it goes through and generates that code for you, your args, that's how it'll be defined. So for example, if I had nullable, you're using Kotlin, it's the question mark, not null. And then here, it'll just show you any actions that are coming out of this destination, and then deep links. If I click on the plus, that's where I can type out my URI, so www.google.com/whatever, and then auto verify. Are any of you guys familiar with the difference between deep links and app links? So auto verify will do. So it's most basic, the deep link is saying, hey, I recognize this URI that this app is registered, it'll support. I guess a good example would be, so if you've ever clicked on a link and you've seen at the bottom of your screen, it pops up and says, would you like to open this with, and then a list of apps. They're using deep links. This lets the user have a choice in which app they want to handle this. It's not verified. They haven't verified that this link really is coming from Ancestry. There's no verification process there. Well, app links, they have been verified by Google. So you set up a well-known URL. This is a huge process to get your app verification done, but that gets rid of the user's choice of, hey, do I want to open this with this app or this app? It's automatically going to open up that deep link in your app if it's installed. Does that make sense?
So hitting auto verify makes it an app link?
So it'll make it an app link, but you still need to do the process on your end of registering that well-known URL. You have to get your signed keys and all that registered. It's
kind of like a global remember me.
It kind of, yeah. So yeah, that's really cool. I mean, as far as having to remember the things you need to put in the manifest, they take care of all of that for you. So with deep links, when you go into your manifest, you have to set these filters. And it's a lot more than one line of code.
The scheme and the URL.
Yeah, the scheme, URL, data, all that stuff. What's really nice is now, if you're using navigation and you've set up this deep link, all you have to do in your manifest is this one-liner, nav graph, and the ID of your graph. It handles the rest for you. Yeah?
Do you need that even if you aren't using deep links?
If you aren't using deep links, you do not need that tag. Yep.
Where do you specify what nav graph you're using for an activity normally?
Yeah, good question.
Or maybe you're going to get there.
Yeah, I am going to get there.
Okay,
it'll be in your activities layout, and in the fragment, you'll specify that, so I'll show you. Okay, and then if we click on this action, here's all the options we have with an action. So the ID of that action, which destination that's going to be, and that destination is going to be the ID, not the fragment class name. And then any animation, so if you have a transition, you've got your 4 transition types, the enter, exit, pop enter, pop exit, and those will just link to animation resources. And then the pop to, so I guess we could look at the game over screen. If we go into action. So the action for game over, we have the pop to, so it's when we hit the back button, it's going to pop back to the match fragment, then inclusive or not. And then single top is kind of their own implementation of what I was describing with the launch modes for activities, but with fragments. So if your fragment is, so if you go from fragment A to fragment A, it's not going to create 2 fragment A's in the fragment backstack. So what does this look like in the XML? We just go down to text, similar to if we're editing a layout. So we have our root navigation tab, and that's what's going to define a nav graph. So you can, so with these nested graphs, you can create another navigation tag within another navigation tag if you want to nest them locally. But you can also, if you wanted to split them out into their own navigation files, you can do that as well. So here's our destination fragment, and then any actions that are associated with that fragment going out of it. I think I have, where's the deep link? And then deep link. So here's our URI, example.com/user/username. Notice how username is the same name as this argument, and that once again ties back to safe args. So you'll want those to be the same name or variable name. And so
is the type safety represented here or not?
Yeah, so the type safety, as far as how you define what that type is here in this argument tag. This one's pretty simple. Oops.
So it's just default, it's not specified.
Yeah, so like here, if I said arg type, that's where you'd say like integer, float, whatever. So I don't ever use this, but they have this, it's like auto-determine, where they try to guess the type based off of the value, the default value. I don't ever use it. I just like saying what I want it to be directly. But yeah, so
I have a question.
Yeah.
So can you go back to the previous screen?
Yeah, you bet.
So if user name was like user ID and it had to be, say, a long, and somebody put some string in there, would this not recognize it as a URL that could open?
Good question. So like you're saying, if this archetype name was UID and it was supposed to be a long,
yeah,
but in the URL it was a string,
yeah,
I've never tried that. Yeah, that's a good question. It'd be a good thing to play around with. I bet you'd have an exception of some sort, but yeah.
Or wouldn't deep link.
Yeah, or it wouldn't and that might be the case too. Maybe it wouldn't deep link. So that's a fantastic question. Yeah.
That would be my preferred behavior.
Yeah. Just don't deep link. Don't pass me up.
That's really a good question.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's a great question. I'll have to look into that. But yeah, so like when you're going through this UI interface, and let's make some. Let's make one. We can see what it turns out to be. Say when we go to this destination, arguments, name. So we'll do the UID example, long. Default value will do 5, and add, and go back to the text. There it is, so name, archetype, default type, 5L. So it's pretty basic to set it all up, and I don't know about you guys, but when I'm creating layouts, I like doing it in the XML personally, because sometimes the editor makes the XML a little messy. I found for the most part, using the UI for the design editor here works pretty good. I don't usually have to run the XML for that.
Another question.
Yeah.
You talked about it a little bit earlier. Where do you specify the difference between where the arc is going versus you're hitting back? And where can you specify back as opposed to?
Oh, it's like the backwards direction,
right.
Back buttons.
Is that defined in this navigation?
Yeah, so it is defined here. So that's with the actions.
Okay.
That's the pop behavior. So you've got the stack. So by the time I've gone from home to game over, I've built this stack of that top flow. And when I'm hitting the back button from game over, it's that pop behavior, pop to match. Says when I hit the back button, I want to pop back directly to the match, and anything between is gone.
Can this be overridden if you have like logic that determines where back goes?
So
like if your score is greater than 10 points, you go here, otherwise you go here.
So that'd be more of a forward behavior, and that you can
that's
change.
True.
Yeah.
That's true.
And so that'd be more of like where we're going in game to game over or results winner. We can see where there's that split off. And so now it's created two actions from that destination. We can programmatically determine which way is right. Any other questions? Yeah.
What if your fragment isn't like covering up the whole screen? How does that work with the back button and like you have multiple?
Yeah, great question. So we'll see that. Maybe it's a good time to go into it. So when you're defining that, so it's called a nav host fragment. Let's open it up. I've got screenshots of it, but why not just go to it? Okay, so activity main. Okay, so in their example here, this is their activities layout. And this doesn't have to be a frame layout. Your root layout can be whatever you want it to be. But you do have to use this fragment. It's a very specific fragment. So the nav host fragment is what manages this. It's what holds your destinations and displays it to the user. And so what determines whether or not your destinations respond to the system back buttons is right here, the default nav host true. So if you set that to false, any of your destinations in that nav host fragment will ignore the back buttons. So that kind of comes into play. Like if you had two nav host fragments in the same UI, only one of them should respond to the system buttons.
Can you change that property at runtime? Based on?
I believe so. I've never had to do it. But there are, so you can programmatically construct your graph, and we'll actually see this where I was talking about the start destinations might need to be more flexible than just one. And so there are properties, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I do believe there's a property you can set for that. Okay. Great questions. So let me go back slides. Okay. So we already talked about safeguards, so we can skip that one. Deep linking. So I guess if you're interested in deep linking really quick, those are some of the constraints. So you can use star wildcard to match more than one character in them. Already talked about that. Showed you that. We were just looking at that. So just make sure I didn't forget any. Yes, so the nav graph. So there's the default nav host and then nav graph at the bottom. If you wanted to change your start destination programmatically, or maybe change the nav graph programmatically, you wouldn't want to set the nav graph in the XML here. You'd leave that out, and then your code is where you would set the nav graph to that nav host fragment. So I'll show you that. Okay, so couple terms. So there's the nav host and the nav controller. So we've been talking about the nav host fragment, which implements nav host. Nav controller is what manages going between the destinations and how I go back. So the nav host is really just the container, while the nav controller is what's controlling how I'm flowing in the app. So if you wanted to change these things programmatically, maybe this would be in your activity, you would get an instance, grab your nav host fragment from the layout, and there's a nav inflator, similar to your layout inflator or menu inflator, which you get from the nav controller, which comes from the nav host fragment. Then you create an instance of your graph, whatever graph you want to have. So you'd say inflator.inflate the resource for your nav graph. And then that's how you can change your start destination dynamically. Once again, you don't have to do this in most cases. This is if you want a more dynamic flow programmatically. And then start destination equals the ID of that destination in your graph.
Otherwise, that main nav graph already has a start destination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like if you did it this way, don't add the nav graph there. But if most cases, you can just set your nav graph there and you're good. This is the way I found out how to do it myself. Google recommends a different way. They say, so back to the onboarding example, have your nested onboarding graph, have your main screen as the start destination, and then programmatically at runtime, navigate them to that subgraph, and then go from there. I haven't done it that way. Early on, like some of us here, I've been figuring this out since the early times of nav components, and this is the first one I went with. Both work. So a couple options there. If you are interested in the way Google's recommended, I can't speak to it out of experience, but their documentation does talk about it if you wanted to look at that option too. Okay, before I move on, did I miss any questions? Are there any more questions that have come up? Okay, so navigating from destination to destination is simple as a one-liner. They've created some really nice extension functions for us. So we just call, this would be in a fragment, find a nav controller. And what it will do is it will traverse your layout graph and find where that nav controller is. And you just call .navigate. And then here's where the generated classes come in. So this is all generated by navigation component, leaderboard directions. So leaderboard is the destination, and then they append directions saying this is where I want to go. So that's the class. So for example, if my fragments class was called home, then it would be home destinations, home directions.
Is that the class you're in right now?
So
is this line inside the leaderboard class, or are you now?
Yeah,
the leaderboard class?
yeah. So this would be so just like any class, you could see leaderboard directions anywhere in your code completion,
Right.
but you would want to only use this within the leaderboard fragment. So leaderboard directions, and then any of those actions that were coming out of it from the graph, it'll generate this action leaderboard. So it's saying leaderboard is the destination to, and then user profile would be the next destination's name. So it kind of takes its own naming conventions, merges it with your class names, and creates that function name for you. So leaderboard directions, action leaderboard to user profile. So very specific where it's saying I'm coming from and going to. And then if you did have safe args, so those arguments we were looking at, you would be able to specify them in your function call there. So in this case, I had one safe arg username, and I can set that to whatever you pull from your data there. Just to compare, if you weren't using safe args, you'd be passing a bundle instead of that type safety. So here, the compiler knows because it's generated this class and function, only a string can go there, and you get a compile time error there if you pass something otherwise. So a little more complex, if you had animations or a shared element transition. So maybe I'm going from a destination with a user profile picture to another destination with that same profile picture. And I wanted that profile picture to kind of nice, seamless transition, make it look like it's not really disappearing and coming back. You could use your shared element transition. So they make this really easy where you still in your XML, the common view, you would set Android transition name and then your transition name, and that would be the same in both layouts for that similar view. And then similar to our last slide, you see find nav controller navigate, there's your directions. And then at the end of that function call, there's this extra parameter shared element extra. And so I create that object right before and so it's called Fragment Navigator Extras, and that's where you pass the ID of that common view with the transition name. And the navigation will handle the rest for you as far as linking those up. So it really just becomes navigate this direction and action, pass my safe args, and my shared element extra. And then you'll still have to do the work inside of your next destination of postponing the inner transition and then continuing it afterward once your data is loaded. Any questions there? Okay. So that's really all it is. When you're navigating between destinations, it's a function call now. You don't have to. Yeah.
Those 2 lines equivalent then? Is that an alternate way to do it?
These 2 up here?
Yes.
Yeah, so the top line is if you're using safe args. The bottom line is if you chose not to use safe args.
You just pass the resource ID instead of the whole class qualified.
Exactly.
Okay.
And obviously, once again, the more we're using the stuff navigation gives us, so safe args, the more type safety we get, the more control, that rigid, like this is the way the app is supposed to work, versus if I just passed on ID, that kind of I could break the graph there, right? Okay, so how do we, so the label we saw in the graph earlier, how do we associate that with our toolbar? So that way it can automatically change the toolbar's title. There's a few ways, you can do this. So if you're using the action bar, you, as normal, set support action bar, give it your toolbar view. And then this extension function, set up action bar with nav controller. Find nav controller. And then, so this is an activity. So the difference between find nav controller and a fragment versus an activity is the activity you have to pass the ID of that fragment that we saw right there, my nav host fragment. In this case, it's a different ID because I copied it from my other project, but that's what it would be. So one-liner, set up action bar with nav controller, give it the nav controller. Any questions there with those 2 lines? Okay. Now, if you wanted to have a little bit more power over, maybe you have a more dynamic title. That's not something you can just set in the XML. I didn't put it in the slides here, but you can pass safe args with the curly braces in the XML. But even if you wanted more power, you can programmatically intercept your navigation events and do things with it from there. So in this case, maybe not with the title, but I wanted a different back arrow button. So this app, for the most part, has the back arrow button, but on one screen, I wanted an X because I was editing something. I've requested this in the issue tracker a while back ago that they can have an easier way to do this. Ian's answer, at least to date, is create this on destination change listener on your nav controller. And based on the destination ID you've navigated to, grab your action bar and set the home as up indicator to whatever you want it to be. That's kind of his answer right now. So if you wanted to change that back arrow button to something else, that last part here is kind of what you do there. Okay. So another way to set up the toolbar. So the last one was using an action bar. Maybe we're not using an action bar where you're just working with the toolbar specifically. You'd say, okay, find your nav controller again, and then your toolbar, there's an extension method off of the toolbar view itself. And so now you could just say, my toolbar view, set up with nav controller, give it the nav controller. And now I'm going to introduce a new parameter called the app bar configuration. So this is optional, but if you do pass an app bar configuration, you can specify to the navigation component, what are my top level destinations? So top level destination does not have a back arrow in the toolbar. And so really it's just a set of destination IDs. And so if the navigation component detects I'm at this destination, I'm not going to enable that back button in the toolbar. Any questions? Cool. And then just another simple example, if you have a bottom navigation view, it's also a one-liner to set that up with your nav graph. So one difference, did I show it here? You want to set the IDs of your destination to the same ID as your menu resource for that bottom navigation view. And with that one-liner, navigation component will match those together and say, oh, this menu resource ID destination 1 matches this nav graph's ID destination 1. This is what I need to go to. This is the most basic example. I'm not going to show it here just because I haven't played around a whole lot with it, but on their GitHub, they have a more complex example where you have basically each bottom navigation tab has its own graph flow, I believe. So it's a lot more complex. You can check that out. Okay, so back to the view models discussion. So the first two are pretty much what we would have been using up to this point until, okay, so view model providers.of this, your view model, that's how you get it. They've also given us a new mind blank. It's the, what's that?
Extension?
No, it's not the extension. It's
Delegate.
Delegate,
Yeah.
yes, thank you. So these view model delegates. So now you can say in your fragment, by view models is the equivalent to that top line if you were in a fragment. And if you wanted to scope that view model to the activity, you'd say by activity view models. So these delegates just simplify less code that we have to write. And with the navigation component, they've now created this by nav graph view models. So I think the power of using of scoping your view model to a graph is when you're using nested graphs. So once again, scope your view models as small as you need them to be. So if a single fragment is all this view model needs to work with, scope it to that fragment. The next step up before it would have been to the activity, but now multiple fragments can have that for the lifespan of that activity. One example, one thing I've used it for is dialogues. So I didn't show it in the slides here, but in the XML of the graph, we just saw those fragment tags. You can also have a dialogue tag. So if you have dialogue fragments, those can be destinations too. So say I have a fragment and a dialogue, and this dialogue takes user input. And I need to share that data between the two. So I can have a view model that's associated with that fragment and the dialogue fragment for that interaction, the exchange of data. And so maybe that view model needs to be scoped to a subgraph, which holds the fragment and the dialogues that it can open up. So that's just a simple example of maybe when you'd want to scope to a view or to a nav graph. Or maybe you have just a collection of fragments that need to work together, but you don't necessarily want to give it the huge scope of an activity, especially in a single activity app. That's the lifespan, it's pretty much global of your app. And so with these nested graphs, you can now just pass it, this is the ID of my graph, and that view model will live for that graph's lifespan. Hope that makes sense. Okay. And then I threw in here to gain a reference to your safe args. So when you're in your fragment and you want to use the data you got from your safe arg, before we would have said arguments and gotten the bundle. Now you just create a variable, use the by nav args delegate, And if your fragment was called my fragment, it'll generate my fragment args.
So that type is wrong, right?
Yes, the type is wrong. It should be my fragment args. Good catch. Any questions there? Okay, there's a lot more to navigation component. I didn't have a whole lot of time to go into much more. Those are some great resources if you want to look at the documentation. I think the navigation component has some of the better documentation Google's got out there. It's really in depth. They've got a ton of examples, ton of different scenarios you can work with there, and it's pretty clear. And then there's a code lab if you're just getting into it. Some thunder and we're done.
Ending on a bang.
Yeah. Any questions?
That's great. Thank you. Will you share the slides with us?
Yeah, definitely. So we'll do. I guess, how much time do we have left?
Whatever time
Not
you
too
need.
much. Yeah. Just curious if you guys, in your apps, your experiences with nav graphs and navigation, do you guys have any cool things to share? Cool experiences?
Just that you can, so you mentioned that you can change the toolbar title with the label property in the nav graph. You can set that in curly braces to one of the arguments that you pass in as as an option. So that's kind of nice as well.
Yeah, no, and I've used that one a little bit, and I agree. It's really nice to use that. There was one. So here's kind of a debate. Maybe here's like a little debate for you guys. So single activity, this is the one thing I've kind of struggled with. Apps that don't have the same toolbar throughout the whole app. Normally your toolbar belongs to the activity. Now, we have this navigation flow where everything's supposed to be in the same activity, but this fragment has your standard toolbar. This other fragment has this super tall, you got your profile picture in it, whatever. You got some inputs. How does that play into single activity? This is a question that I'm still delving into. Just to share maybe my thoughts and experiences, I've seen a couple ways. The YouTube app, from what I can observe, is they are dynamically, so they have, it seems like they have this toolbar scoped to the activity, and they have other pieces of that toolbar which they're showing and hiding based off of the destination you're at in the bottom navigation view. And you'll notice, which tab is it? I think it's the inbox tab. Yeah, so like if you went to the inbox tab, you notice they have two tabs, messages and notifications. So if you're toggling between inbox and home, you'll see that toolbar is changing size. So here, I think what they're doing is they're hiding and showing certain parts of that toolbar based off of where you're at. If you look at the Google Keep app, it looks like they're doing something a little bit different. It looks like they are putting the toolbar in the fragments themselves. And so I don't know, that's just a little bit of food for thought to leave you guys with as you think about single activity and navigation. It's a challenge when you think about your toolbars and how that definitely changes your app architecture there. So it's something that I've thought about. Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.